A secret pact between dictators who despised each other. A staged attack on a German radio station by Germans dressed as Poles. A fabricated broadcast blaming Warsaw for an act of war that never happened. These were the lies behind September 1st, 1939. It was the morning the invasion of Poland sparked the deadliest conflict in human history, and the fuse was lit long before the first shot was fired. After absorbing Austria and dismantling Czechoslovakia, Hitler's gaze shifted to the free city of Danzig and the Polish corridor, territories Germany lost after World War I. In the Reichstag, he insisted that Danzig was and is a German city, and that the corridor was and is German, casting his demands as the correction of past wrongs. German envoys pushed for Danzig's return and an extraterritorial highway, but Poland's foreign minister Josef Beck stood firm, refusing to compromise national sovereignty. As these disputes played out, a more decisive move unfolded in Moscow. On August 23, 1939, Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov signed a non-aggression pact. Publicly, it promised peace, but secretly, it carved up Poland and Eastern Europe, with detailed maps tracing a line from the Baltic to the Carpathians. The pact handed Hitler a strategic shield. Soviet neutrality meant he could strike Poland without risking a war on two fronts. The secret protocol, hidden for decades, spelled out the division Germany in the West and the Soviets in the East. Poland stood isolated. Night fell on August 31, 1939, as a covert team led by Alfred Naujoks gathered outside the Gleiwitz radio transmitter near the border between Germany and Poland. Acting under direct orders from Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Nazi Sicherheitsdienst, the men wore Polish uniforms and carried out a carefully rehearsed plan. At 9:45 that evening, they stormed the station and forced a brief broadcast in Polish, denouncing German aggression and calling for resistance. The transmission, scripted in advance, lasted only a few minutes before the attackers left behind two bodies, prisoners executed to pose as fallen Polish saboteurs. Gestapo reports filed the next morning described the incident as a violent Polish incursion, complete with photographic evidence and staged casualties. Naujoks later testified at Nuremberg that the entire event was orchestrated, down to the smallest detail, to create a justification for war. Within hours, German diplomats cited Gleiwitz as proof of Polish hostility in notes sent to foreign governments. The false flag at Gleiwitz was not an isolated act, but the final pretext needed to launch the invasion. On August 28, 1939, the German government delivered a final set of demands to Poland. These included the immediate return of Danzig and a plebiscite for the Polish corridor. Accepting would have meant surrendering vital territory and national independence. The Polish cabinet refused, unwilling to barter away sovereignty under threat. In London, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain addressed Parliament, warning that Britain would stand by its commitments. He said that if they insisted on using force again, we were resolved to oppose them by force. His words left little room for doubt. The German Foreign Ministry, however, insisted that Poland had rejected a peaceful solution and began preparing official statements to justify military action. British and French diplomats, aware of the German troop buildup along the border, issued urgent warnings but received no concessions. With the ultimatum unanswered and diplomatic channels closing, Hitler ordered his generals to proceed. The countdown had ended. The machinery of war, set in motion by failed negotiations and rigid ultimatums, now moved forward without pause. At dawn on September 1, 1939, German forces unleashed a new kind of warfare across the Polish border. The plan, known as Fall Weiss, relied not on slow-moving infantry, but on the speed and shock of blitzkrieg, lightning war. Panzer divisions, led by commanders like Heinz Guderian, spearheaded the attack. Tanks roared forward in tightly coordinated columns, supported by mechanized infantry and mobile artillery. Overhead, more than 1,300 Luftwaffe aircraft swept the skies, their Stuka dive bombers equipped with screaming sirens designed to terrify anyone below. OKW directives called for maximum momentum, armored thrusts on twin axes, north toward Danzig and south toward Krakow, aimed to slice through Polish defenses before they could organize a counterattack. Air and ground units worked in tandem, with Luftwaffe manuals instructing pilots to strike communication lines, rail junctions, and troop concentrations just ahead of the advancing tanks. Within hours, the Polish front began to splinter. The doctrine demanded relentless pressure, bypassing strongpoints and encircling resistance. By nightfall, the German advance had already penetrated deep into Polish territory, proving that speed and coordination could shatter even the most determined defense. On the windswept peninsula of Westerplatte, a small Polish garrison braced for the onslaught. For 7 days, from September 1st to 7th, 1939, fewer than 200 defenders, soldiers, railway workers, and volunteers held out against repeated German assaults by land, sea, and air. Major Henryk Sucharski and his men faced relentless shelling and bombing, refusing to yield even as their fortifications crumbled and supplies ran low. Letters from the garrison, later recovered, described the deafening roar of naval guns and the stubborn hope that relief might come. When surrender became inevitable, the battered survivors emerged, having delayed thousands of German troops and inspired a nation with their stand. Elsewhere, the Polish army mounted a bold counterattack along the Bzura River. Beginning on September 9th, Generals Tadeusz Kostrzewa and Władysław Bortnowski led over 140,000 men in a surprise offensive. Polish units struck hard, recapturing towns and inflicting heavy losses on German divisions. The fighting raged for 10 days, drawing in more than 150,000 German soldiers as the Wehrmacht scrambled to contain the threat. Despite initial gains, overwhelming airstrikes and armored reinforcements forced the Poles to withdraw. The Bzura counteroffensive delayed the German advance on Warsaw and remains the largest Polish battle of the campaign. Through these acts, on the battered peninsula and the muddy fields of central Poland, officers and ordinary soldiers alike showed that resistance was not futile, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Before sunrise on September 1st, 1939, the town of Wielun became the first civilian target of the war. Luftwaffe bombers struck at 4:40 in the morning, flattening the hospital, market square, and rows of homes. No military units were stationed there. Yet more than 1,200 residents died in the rubble, most still asleep when the bombs fell. Richard Overy describes the attack as deliberate terror, meant to sow panic and shatter morale. In Wielun's aftermath, the roads filled with refugees. By mid-September, over 1.5 million Poles were on the move, pushing carts, carrying children, sometimes walking for days with nowhere safe to go. The columns stretched for miles, vulnerable to machine gun fire and bombing runs. Families were separated, and entire villages emptied in hours. Among the chaos, a stubborn myth took root, that Polish cavalry charged German tanks in a hopeless act of bravery. In reality, cavalry units fought as mobile infantry, using anti-tank rifles and grenades, not sabers against armor. The legend, born of propaganda and confusion, obscures the true story. A nation's civilians were caught between advancing armies, their lives upended by violence and fear. Before dawn on September 17, 1939, the Red Army columns crossed the Bug River, advancing along routes mapped weeks earlier in the secret protocol. Soviet rifle divisions and tank battalions swept through the eastern borderlands, meeting scattered resistance from exhausted Polish units already retreating from the German onslaught. Soviet commanders issued proclamations claiming to liberate Ukrainian and Belarusian populations, but the orders from Moscow were clear: annexation, not rescue. Within days, Soviet authorities dissolved Polish civil administration, replaced it with commissars, and began mass arrests. The NKVD targeted officers, officials, and anyone seen as a threat. By the end of September, the eastern third of Poland was absorbed into the Soviet Union, its fate sealed not by battle, but by the stroke of a pen and the machinery of Stalin's state. Neville Chamberlain stood before the House of Commons on September 3, 1939. His voice was heavy as he declared that Britain was at war with Germany. The British ultimatum had expired unanswered, and France followed within hours. Leaders framed their decisions as a defense of European liberty, invoking solemn treaty obligations to Poland. Yet, as war was declared, Allied armies remained behind their own borders. French commanders, wary from memories of the last war, hesitated to launch a full-scale assault. British expeditionary forces began to mobilize, but the Western Front saw only scattered skirmishes along the Saar. For months, millions of soldiers waited in muddy trenches, while diplomats and generals debated their next move. This uneasy pause, soon known as the Phony War, showed that the conflict had widened, but decisive action was still out of reach. The invasion of Poland shattered any illusion that civilians could remain untouched by modern war. From the first bombs dropped on Whelan to the forced deportations that followed Soviet occupation, the campaign revealed a new kind of conflict, one where entire populations could become targets. Historians point to these weeks as a warning. Secret pacts and unreliable alliances left nations exposed, while the machinery of total war swept aside old boundaries between soldier and civilian. The fate of Poland foreshadowed tragedies yet to come, including the mass executions at Katyn and the systematic targeting of non-combatants across Europe. Borders are drawn and redrawn, but the cost of aggression never fades. Today, the echoes of 1939 still shape how nations respond to threats and alliances. The world learned the price of silence and appeasement, lessons that remain urgent with every crisis that tests the fragile peace.